The envelope was stapled to my storage unit door when I rolled up in the wheelchair. White paper, HOA letterhead, the words "Final Notice" in red ink across the top. I pulled it off with hands that still shook from 3 weeks of hospital IVs and opened it standing there in the Oklahoma heat while my daughter steadied the chair behind me. Due to abandonment and failure to maintain premises, Ridgewood Commons HOA has assumed control of Storage Unit 14, be effective immediately. Contents have been relocated to community reserve space, pending disposition. I read it twice. Then I looked at the padlock on my unit. Not mine. Theirs. Bright silver Home Depot special still showing the price sticker. And I felt something cold and perfectly clear settle into my chest. Not rage. Clarity. Because what they didn't know, what Gerald Dupree and his 3-person board had somehow never bothered to check, was that I didn't rent this unit from them. I owned the land it sat on. All 6 storage units. The access road they drove in on. And the drainage easement their clubhouse was built across without a permit. I had the deed in my truck. I'd kept it there for 11 years, ever since my father died, and left me this mess of property lines and unrecorded agreements that I'd never had reason to enforce. Until today. Let me take you back to where this started. My name is Paul Steadman. I'm 52 years old. I built industrial HVAC systems for 27 years before the heart attack in June that put me in Mercy Hospital's cardiac ICU for 18 days, followed by another week in recovery. I live alone in a double wide on 4 acres outside Ridgewood Commons, a planned community that grew up around my family's old property in 2008, when developers bought the surrounding farmland and started selling half-acre lots to people from Tulsa who wanted country living with a neighborhood watch. The storage units weren't always storage units. They started as my father's workshop, 6 connected bays he built in 1987 to restore tractors, store equipment, and house the carpentry business he ran until his back gave out. When he passed in 2013, I inherited the property and converted 5 of the bays into rentals. I kept 1 for myself. Good side income. Quiet tenants. No trouble for a decade. Ridgewood Commons HOA formed in 2009. I wasn't part of it. My land predated their plat by 30 years, and I'd never signed a covenant or attended a meeting. They had no authority over me. And that had been fine until Gerald Dupree got elected board president 2 years ago and decided every property within visual range of the neighborhood needed to meet community standards. I got my first violation notice in March 2023, unauthorized commercial activity. I wrote back with a copy of my county business license and heard nothing for 4 months. Then another notice in July, unapproved structure visible from common area. I ignored it. The structure was legal, permitted, and on my land. The 3rd notice came in May of this year, certified mail, threatening enforcement action if I didn't submit architectural plans for HOA approval. I was drafting a response when the heart attack hit. It happened on a Monday morning. I was replacing a compressor coil at a job site in Bristow, felt the tightness in my chest, told the site manager I needed to sit down, and woke up 3 days later intubated in a hospital bed with my daughter Rebecca driving in from Wichita, because the cardiologist said it had been close. I don't remember the first week. I remember fragments of the second, alarms, nurses, a surgery I couldn't pronounce. Rebecca stayed the whole time. She called my clients, filed my insurance, closed the workshop, and put a note on my front door explaining I was hospitalized. She did everything right. What she didn't know to do was check the storage units. Neither did I. They were rented, locked, paid through August. There was no reason to think anyone would touch them. Gerald Dupree touched them on day 9. I found this out later from my tenant in Unit 14A, a retired schoolteacher named Marilyn Voss who kept Christmas decorations and her late husband's book collection in there. She called Rebecca on June 22nd, cautiously, asking if I'd authorized the HOA to access the property. Rebecca said no. Marilyn said she'd been there that morning to retrieve a box and found 2 men with bolt cutters removing the locks on all 6 units. One of them was Gerald. The other was Dennis Howell, the HOA treasurer. They told her the units were being reclaimed under HOA authority due to the owner's incapacity and failure to respond to violation notices. Marilyn took pictures. She asked for documentation. Gerald told her this was an internal HOA matter and she could file a complaint at the next board meeting if she had concerns. Then they changed the locks and started moving things. Rebecca found out 3 days later and drove to the property. By then they'd emptied 4 units into a storage container behind the HOA clubhouse and were halfway through mine. She called the police. The officer who responded said it looked like a property dispute and suggested we handle it through civil channels. Rebecca called a lawyer and got voicemail. She took photos, documented everything, and then came back to the hospital to tell me what had happened while I was learning to walk to the bathroom without chest pain. I told her to let it sit. I needed to get out first. I needed to see it myself. 3 weeks later, I did. The man who answered Gerald Dupree's door was smaller than I expected. Mid-60s, golf shirt, reading glasses hanging from a lanyard. He looked at me in the wheelchair, then at Rebecca standing behind me, and said, "Mr. Steadman, I'd heard you were recovering. I'm glad you're doing better." I said, "You took my property." He folded his arms. The HOA exercised enforcement authority under Article 7 of the Community Bylaws, which permits corrective action on non-compliant structures within the community boundaries. You were sent multiple notices. When you failed to respond for over 30 days, we took necessary steps. I pulled the folded paper from my lap and held it up. This is the 1981 survey plat for this property. It shows the boundary line between my father's land and what became Ridgewood Commons. The storage units sit 140 feet inside my property line. Your community boundary ends at the drainage ditch on the east side of Maple Road. You have no authority here. You never did. Gerald's face didn't change. That's a matter of interpretation. The covenants clearly state, I never signed your covenants. I'm not a member of your HOA. I don't live in Ridgewood Commons. I live on private land my family has owned since 1979, and you removed locks and displaced property from structures you have zero legal claim to. He stepped back slightly. We acted in good faith based on the information available. If you believe our interpretation was incorrect, you're welcome to bring it up at the next board meeting. Rebecca's hand tightened on the wheelchair handle. I said, I don't need a board meeting. I need my locks replaced and my tenant's property returned by end of business tomorrow, or I'm filing for criminal trespass and civil theft. Gerald smiled, thin and careful. Mr. Steadman, I don't think you understand how these situations work. We have a process. We have community standards. If you want to operate a commercial facility in visual range of a residential neighborhood, there are procedures. I unfolded the second document, the one I'd pulled from the county recorder's office 3 days earlier during my first trip out of the house. This is the drainage easement map filed with Osage County in 2009 when your neighborhood was platted. It shows a 20-foot drainage corridor running east to west along the southern boundary of your development. Your clubhouse, the one where you hold your board meetings, sits 14 feet into that easement. The county never approved construction there. You built it without a permit. The smile left his face. I own that easement, I said. It's attached to my property deed as part of the original land transfer. Your clubhouse is on my easement without authorization, without a lease, and without any recorded instrument giving you the right to be there. Gerald said nothing for 5 seconds. Then, that's been there since 2011. It's grandfathered. Grandfathered requires a legal agreement. Do you have one? He didn't answer. I folded both documents and set them back in my lap. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to unlock my storage units today. You're going to return every item you removed in the condition you found it. You're going to reimburse my tenant Marilyn Voss for the lock replacement she had to pay for herself. And you're going to send a written apology to all 6 of my tenants for the disruption. You have 72 hours. And if we don't, then I enforce the easement. I file with the county to have your clubhouse declared an unpermitted structure on restricted land. You'll be ordered to remove it at your own expense, and I'll bill you for every day it sat there without a lease. 11 years of back rent at commercial rates comes to about $48,000. Rebecca made a small sound behind me. Gerald stared. I said, well, you can unlock the units. They unlocked the units. It took 4 days instead of 3, but by the following Monday morning, all 6 storage bays had their original locks restored, and a moving crew, hired by the HOA, had returned every box, tool chest, and piece of furniture they'd removed. Marilyn got a check for $60 and a printed apology, signed by all 3 board members. My tenant in 14C got his hunting equipment back. My own bay, which they'd emptied entirely, was restocked down to the last paint can. Gerald didn't deliver any of it personally. He sent Dennis Howell, who handed me an envelope containing a formal retraction of all previous violation notices and acknowledgement, signed by the board, that my property lay outside HOA jurisdiction. I asked Dennis if Gerald wanted to say anything else. Dennis said, "He's exploring options." I told him to explore carefully. The lawyer I retained, a property attorney named Claudia Reese, filed a formal claim with Osage County 2 weeks later requesting a review of the easement encroachment and the clubhouse permit status. The county sent an inspector in early August. His report noted multiple deficiencies: no permit on file, no engineering review, and a structure sitting in a drainage corridor that was explicitly prohibited from development under the 2009 plat conditions. The county issued a notice of violation to Ridgewood Commons HOA on August 18. They had 90 days to either obtain a retroactive permit, which would require an engineering study and would likely be denied, or remove the structure. Gerald called me on August 20th. His voice was different, quieter. He asked if there was a way to resolve this without dismantling the clubhouse. I told him there was. The lease agreement I drafted was simple. Ridgewood Commons HOA would pay $450 per month to occupy the 14-foot section of drainage easement their clubhouse encroached upon. The lease would be month to month, terminable by either party with 30 days' notice, and it included a provision that any future violation notices, enforcement actions, or attempts to assert HOA authority over my property would constitute grounds for immediate termination. Claudia reviewed it and called it airtight. Gerald signed it on September 3rd in Claudia's office, along with Dennis Howell and the third board member, a woman named Stephanie Kurtz who'd stayed silent through the entire dispute. The back rent, calculated at the same monthly rates starting from the clubhouse's construction date in 2011, came to $47,700. I agreed to a structured payment plan, $10,000 up front, and the remainder paid over 24 months at $1,570 per month in addition to the $450 lease payment. The first check cleared on September 10th. I deposited it and then drove to the storage units. Marilyn Voss was there, loading a box of ornaments into her truck. She saw me and smiled, the kind of smile that carried relief. "Everything back where it belongs?" I asked. "Every last box," she said. I counted. I told her the HOA wouldn't be a problem anymore. She nodded, then paused. "You know, I almost didn't call your daughter. I thought maybe you'd worked something out with them. I'm glad you did." "Me too." She closed the truck. "My husband used to say the quiet ones are the ones you don't see coming." I thought about that as she drove off. Gerald Dupree resigned from the HOA board in October, citing personal reasons in a 2-sentence email to the community. Dennis Howell took over as interim president. The first thing he did was send a memo to all Ridgewood Commons residents clarifying the HOA's jurisdiction boundaries and noting that several properties on the perimeter, including mine, were not part of the association and were not subject to its covenants. I heard through Maryland that the memo caused some friction. People asking why they'd been paying dues to an HOA that didn't know where its own boundaries were. At the November meeting, attendance was the highest it had been in 2 years. Dennis survived a no-confidence vote by 3 ballots. I didn't attend. It wasn't my community. It never had been. By December, I was back to work part-time, taking smaller jobs, local contracts that didn't require long days in the heat. The heart attack had changed things. Not just physically. I tired faster, needed more rest, but in the way I looked at what mattered. Rebecca visited more. We had dinners. We talked about her kids, her job, the things I'd missed while I was busy not paying attention. One evening she asked if I regretted not pushing harder, not taking the HOA to court, not making it hurt more than it did. I told her no. I'd gotten what I needed. My property back, my tenants whole, and a lease that paid me $2,000 a month for land I'd already owned. Revenge wasn't the goal. Clarity was. They'd crossed a line assuming I was too incapacitated to do anything about it. They were wrong. That was enough. She asked what I'd do if they stopped paying. I said I'd enforce the lease. Simple as that. She smiled. "You sound like Dad." I took that as the compliment it was. The storage units are still there, all 6 of them, rented and quiet. Maryland's lease runs through next summer. The tenant in 14C just signed for another year. I raised the rent modestly in January. First increase in 3 years, and nobody complained. The clubhouse is still there too, hosting board meetings and book clubs, and whatever else the HOA schedules. The lease payment comes in on the 1st of every month, direct deposit, no delays. Dennis runs the HOA now with a lighter hand than Gerald did. I see him occasionally at the gas station. We nod. We don't talk. The land is still mine. It always was. The difference now is that everyone knows it, and there's a recorded lease in the county files that makes it permanent. If another board president decides to test the boundaries 10 years from now, they'll find the same walls I built, documentation, patience, and the kind of clarity that only comes from knowing exactly what you own and what you're willing to defend. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to perform. I just needed to show them the deed, the plat, and the easement map, and let the arithmetic do the rest. They took my property while I was learning to walk again. I came back and handed them a bill. Some lessons cost $47,700. This one did. And every month, when that lease payment clears, I'm reminded that the person who truly understands property rights doesn't need to raise their voice. They just need to know where the lines are, keep the documents, and wait for the moment when someone else forgets. I haven't forgotten. I won't.